My partner and I affirm the resolution resolved the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. Definitions: reparations, the making of amends for a wrong one has done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who've been wronged, from the Oxford Dictionary. African Americans is an American of African and especially of Black African descent, from the Merriam-Webster. Observations. 1. Ought in the resolution implies moral obligation, from the Oxford Dictionary. The only burden of proof for the affirmation is that there is a moral obligation. Therefore, if we prove that there is a moral obligation, the vote must go to pro. 2. The round must be weighed on justice. Contention 1. Governmental oppression means a moral obligation. Subpoint A. Economic inequality. The Boston Globe finds, research confirms that early slave use in the Americas was correlated with poor long-term growth. Slavery led to inequality, which led to economic underdevelopment. Limited political rights for slaves and their descendants played a role, as did negligible access to credit and capital. Racial discrimination, too, would have played a part. The destruction of slavery did not destroy all the political institutions, social mores, and cultural traditions that sustained it. African Americans have been thought of as lesser than other races and therefore have been left in the dust. Alexander Coffin writes, Black homeownership rates in the U.S. have historically been lower than white homeownership rates, primarily due to a long history of racist housing policies that legal reforms have not entirely erased. During the housing boom of the last decade, Blacks were more likely to get stuck with high-cost subprime mortgage loans than whites, and in the crash, Blacks were more likely to lose their homes than whites. Harvard goes on to say Black median family income is consistently in the range of 55 to 61% of the white median family income. Black workers are often the first to be laid off during an economic recession and the last to be recalled. Economically speaking, African Americans have been extremely disadvantaged. Providing reparations allows for them to be raised economically and also spreads the equality ideology. Subpoint B, an unfair justice system. Racism also affects how African Americans are treated in the criminal justice system. Reporter John Greenberg states, when comparing death rates, Blacks are about 3 times more likely than whites to die in a confrontation with police. Pino Joseph finds 490 people were killed by police this year as of writing, and 138 of whom were African American. That's close to 30%, which is a disproportionate number considering Blacks make up only 12% of the U.S. population. The prison population, for example, has increased from 300,000 to 2.3 million in the past 35 years, with Blacks making up almost half that number. According to The Guardian, Black Americans are more than twice as likely to be unarmed when killed during encounters with police as white people. These disturbing facts all show the extent of how racism hurts the Black community. Reparations can change this by creating a larger understanding of equality and acceptance. The impact of this contention is basically that economically and through the government justice system, African Americans have been dehumanized and drastically disadvantaged as a point of slavery, which the USFG allowed. What this means is that there is a definite moral obligation by the U.S. federal government to pay these reparations. Contention 2, increased political action and activism against racism. Jane Valencia finds that only 31% of white Americans believe racism is a serious problem in the United States. Jana Thompson from the University of Melbourne writes that if the U.S. federal government pays reparations, they are more likely to push for the civil rights agenda later as well. She also states that if the U.S. passes policy relating to the morals of mitigating racism, the government is more likely to stick to those morals in the future. Furthermore, overall discourse and activism is taken against racism will be a result of reparations. This is also proven with affirmative action. Problems with higher education finds that there is a connection between affirmative action and the world agitation for reparations that we now experience. The impact of this is that with more action towards the civil rights agenda, there is more activism and fight for equality. Making these decisions is the only way to mitigate racism in the future. Furthermore, this will create discussion about reparations for other minorities, taking a step towards solving the problem. For these reasons, I urge an affirmative vote.
Judges ready? Sam and I firmly negate that the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. We agree with the pro's definitions of reparations as monetary. However, ought isn't just a moral obligation. The pro has to show the benefits. Our first contention is spending. Larry Neal, an economist at the University of Illinois, estimates that the minimum federal reparations to African Americans would cost $6.5 trillion. There are 2 impacts to spending. First is poverty. According to a Forbes article from 2011, this large spending is particularly ineffective in reducing poverty because cash handouts don't increase economic mobility. The article explains that even though Obama has spent trillions of dollars, the poverty rate is the worst it's been in 2 decades. Spending $6.5 trillion on reparations will not improve the poverty levels of African Americans. It will worsen poverty levels in all other minority groups as well. The second impact is discrimination. A study done at NYU in 2014 demonstrated that people perceive race differently during an economic downturn. Researchers indicate that that kind of perception is likely to increase discrimination against people of color. Therefore, reparations would only increase racism and hatred towards African Americans and increase racial tensions. Our second contention is legality. First subpoint is standing. Reparations for African Americans do not satisfy the doctrine of standing in American law. The doctrine of standing requires plaintiffs to show that their injuries are actually distinct from the general injuries of the American public, and that the harmful action is traceable to one or more specific defendants. According to the National Legal and Policy Center, U.S. District Court Judge Charles Norgal dismissed a 2004 lawsuit in which African American plaintiffs asked for reparations for the 350 million descendants of African slaves. In his decision, he established that a genealogical tie to slaves is not enough to prove legal injury. Epstein from the University of Chicago adds that every direct descendant from a slave today is 1 part slave descendant and 127 parts not slave descendant, unless there is a slave somewhere else in his or her line of descent. The impact to standing is justice. In disputes involving civil rights, it is extremely important to adhere to the standards of justice that have been set by American courts. Civil rights abuses only happen when Americans choose to ignore the standards of justice in pursuit of a political goal, which is exactly what led to the years of segregation and oppression by America. A vote for the pro is a vote to bypass justice in favor for political gain, which will set an extremely dangerous precedent and hurt civil rights in the long run. Subpoint B is the statute of limitations. A statute of limitations is a standard restriction in American law that requires court cases to be filed while the claim is still valid. Epstein from the University of Chicago explained that the legal problem with reparations is that each passing year results in the multiplication of the number of descendants to whom some fractional interests have passed, which means that it would actually benefit African Americans to continue asking for reparations every single year, because if reparations were enforced by the federal government, then the amount of people who can claim reparations would multiply. The impact to this is giving people a legal justification for the abuse of the government resources and taxpayer dollars. When the federal government paid reparations to the Japanese, it was able to make one-time payments because they were to only people who were actually forced into internment camps or their immediate next of kin. However, with African American claims to reparations, the claim that an African American mother has reparations is practically indistinguishable from the claim that her son has. That's why reparations won't work and traps the U.S. in a cycle of endless obligatory government spending, which takes our debt and economy. Subpoint C, the status quo solves. While there's no legal basis for the federal government paying reparations to African Americans, there are better alternatives within the corporate sector. The U.S. Department of Justice reports in 2011 that the countrywide home loans agreed to pay $335 million to Hispanic and African American victims of housing discrimination. The Wall Street Journal adds that in 2012, SunTrust and 5 other large banks agreed to pay a total of $25 billion in reparations to African Americans for discriminatory lending policies. This means that the African Americans who are directly affected by institutional racism are already receiving reparations through local and state court cases. Reverting to a justice system based on race is a backward step for American democracy and an extremely dangerous system to have. And this is why we negate the resolution and urge a negative ballot.
Okay, do you agree that there is an economic disparity between white Americans and black Americans in the United States today?
Yeah, we're saying, that's fine, but we're saying that by paying reparations, that's only going to make it worse. Okay. It's going to enforce a cycle of poverty and discrimination. Yeah, so you talk about how there's an unfair justice system in the prison, basically criminal justice system right now, right?
Correct.
So, based on that, how can you say that we should be paying reparations? Because, as our second contention states, our second contention subpoint B states that this enforces an unjust and sets a bad precedent for future justice systems. So
okay,
how can
reparations we view in a multitude of things. Because we are in a public forum debate, we don't actually have to have an advocacy or a plan for what the reparations would hold. So it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have to be a monetary value. It could be in the form of scholarship bonds or something else. As far as the justice system, we could have
Can I ask you a question about what African Americans face today? So, how many African Americans are affected by police brutality or have faced police brutality?
Well, I know I've said this in my case, but more African Americans, so there's about twice as likely to be unarmed when killed during encounters with police as white people.
So if we want to fix the justice system and correcting these wrongs,
Correct.
how does it do that if reparations are going to make the justice system worse?
Well, as I said before, reparations can be in the form of anything. It doesn't necessarily have to filter straight into the justice system. We could work to pull these people out of poverty by giving them education, by giving them better housing, by putting them in a better socioeconomic level to increase.
Okay, but that
their
just
mobility.
ties back into our first contention on spending.
I mean, this is not a. Wait, so do you have a question?
Well, I just asked
Okay.
one, so you can ask me.
So, are African Americans taxpayers too?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a question?
That was it. Okay,
Yeah.
so basically on your first contention you talk about income inequality.
Mm-hmm.
So how are they supposed to get out of poverty if spending's going to make the economy worse?
Okay, so again, we don't necessarily have to give a plan. So all of these theoretical.
But paying reparations means spending money.
It could be taking money out of any sector of the government. It doesn't
Like what
necessarily have to
sector?
filter straight out of the economic. It could be out of money that's going towards a war, or or taxpayer money, etc., etc. It doesn't necessarily have to be.
But the
filtered
federal
straight out of the
government gets
economy.
most of its money from taxpayer dollars, right?
Sure, that doesn't necessarily mean that in the future reparations would come out of this money. You can't just assume things. We don't have a crystal ball to tell us what reparations are going to cause in the future.
But we
That's why
we
it's a
brought
moral
up a card that
obligation.
says that we would have to pay
That's
$6.5 trillion.
Okay, we'll take some- There's about 20 seconds.
Is everyone ready? Yeah? Okay. Start time now. So judges, first let's go over the framework in today's round. With the resolution, it states that we, as the affirmative, our only burden is to prove that the U.S. federal government has a moral obligation. That's what ought implies according to the Oxford Dictionary, so look to our definition since they don't provide a source for theirs. So all we need to show you is that the U.S. federal government has a moral obligation to pay reparations to African Americans, whether or not it seems plausible. Okay? Now moving on to their first contention where they talk about spending. And they say that because it's going to cost so much money, we shouldn't do it. Again, we only have to prove that there is a moral obligation of the government to pay reparations. We don't have to prove that it's great for the economy. But even if you do buy that point, we could actually potentially pull people out of poverty because of reparations. According to Reuters, today reparations would affect 44.5 million Americans, most of whom are in a position or could eventually be in a position to do far more with this money than just spend it. This stimulus would lead to both entrepreneurship and investment and potential direct poverty alleviation for 3.2% of the total population, assuming the cash-based reparation payments would be large enough to lift even the poorest recipient above the poverty line. So what you're seeing is that we actually have an empirical number about the number of people who could be pulled out of poverty because of reparations. This is the base impact presented in today's round, and therefore you should vote affirmative just off of this. But even if you don't, let's move on to their second point where they talk about the legality and the doctrine of standing. They said that essentially in this point they're saying that the number of people who will claim reparations will continue to grow. Again, this doesn't prove that it's immoral to give people reparations. African Americans were severely emotionally harmed by the effects of slavery and put at an economic disadvantage, and just because there's a lot of them does not mean that we shouldn't do it. Completely ignore this point because it has no impact and it does not actually negate the morality of reparations. Moving on, where they talk about in their subpoint B that it's a dangerous precedent for civil rights. However, it actually sets a good precedent. According to the Harvard Law Review, the public investigation into the lingering effects of slavery and Jim Crow should create an unabridged version of American history, one that could eventually bring the end of race preference programs and the start of a dialogue about race focused on the future. So what you're seeing in this article is that essentially by implementing reparations, we're opening up the discussion about racism, and we're allowing, we're setting a precedent that we could actually set more laws into place that will desegregate society. So what you're seeing is that by opening up a dialogue and by educating Americans about the problems faced by African Americans, we can essentially desegregate society. Moving on to their third contention, where they talk about that there are better alternatives and that essentially that we're already paying African Americans money. However, this does not solve for racism. We're showing you that through reparations, we're investigating into slavery and Jim Crow, educating people, and as my partner stated in her first speech, 31% of white Americans do not agree that slavery is a serious problem. This is a serious problem. We need to educate America on how slavery is still affecting people today and how they're at a severe economic disadvantage and how reparations will help fix this. So yes, there are programs in place that are helping people, but it's not enough. In the status quo, automatically African Americans are at a disadvantage. There's a disproportionate amount of African Americans convicted for felonies, way more than whites, even though the crimes committed by them are essentially the same. So what you're seeing is that there is inherent racism, and we aren't going to solve this by giving them money without actually having reparations targeted specifically towards African Americans. Look at the impacts in today's debate. We show you that reparations can provide economic benefits and benefits towards trying to solve racism in the future. All they say is that it's going to cost us money. Look to the point about war. Wars cost us so much money. That doesn't mean that it's not the right thing to do. We go into wars because it's the moral thing to do, not because, it's too much money, we just don't do it because of that. We need to look at morality in this debate as the most important thing, and for these reasons, vote affirmative. Thank you.
Yeah.
They started already.
Okay, stop that. That is 45 seconds. Okay, are my judges ready? Opponents? Partner? Okay. So first, we agree with the definition of reparations as making amends for a wrong by paying money or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. On the first observation, they talk about how the pro-burden is to prove that there's a moral obligation. And we agree with this, but if we prove that reparations will have more negative impacts than positive impacts, then that moral obligation does not exist, because the government is not morally obligated to do harm, and I don't expect my opponents to disagree with that. So the first reason overall that you vote neg right now is that in their case, they do not prove their own burden. They fail to establish why exactly the federal government itself is responsible for slavery. They talk about how segregation exists in society and this is all bad and this stems from slavery. But they don't talk about why the federal government is responsible, why the federal government needs to be the actor. So they are not proving their own burden that the federal government has a moral obligation at all. And on the first contention, their subpoint, they talked about how economic inequality has developed from slavery and that there are racist housing policies that need reparations to be paid. But again, they've not proven that the federal government is the cause of this economic inequality because of housing departments, and we contend that in fact it is not the federal government, it is the mortgage companies. Cross-apply the Zibel 2014 evidence my partner read, which shows that SunTrust and 5 other large banks recently paid several thousand African Americans and Hispanics over $25 billion in reparations for housing discrimination, because they were the ones who were proved that they had the injury in court and that they were responsible. This completely takes out their contention about housing because it proves that the status quo solves for the specific harms that African Americans have suffered from because of housing. So this is already being solved now. And then their second contention about the justice system. They say that police brutality disproportionately affects Black Americans. But first, the first reason you reject this is because the police force is not controlled by the federal government. It is controlled mainly by the states. So there is no reason why the federal government should have to pay reparations for what state laws and state police forces are doing. If anything, that should be the state's responsibility. And the second reason, if you don't buy that, you would still reject the contention because police brutality does not affect all African Americans. Although police brutality disproportionately affects African Americans in comparison to other races, it does not affect all. So there's no reason why people who are not being affected by police brutality deserve reparations from that.
In addition, they've failed to provide us a number with how many African Americans have been affected by police brutality. But additionally, in the current system that exists now, if a person is wronged by a police officer and they can prove that, they can still go to court and get reparations for criminal injustice. But what the Prose case calls for is the restructuring of the justice system so that African Americans just receive reparations based on their race and not on what actually happened to them. This goes against the principles of democracy. And then they said only 31% of whites think that racism is a problem, and we think this is also a problem. Racism is also a problem. But cross-apply our NYU evidence we brought up during our first case that says that racial discrimination will only increase with an economic downturn that will be caused by this enormous amount of spending. So this is a reason to vote nay, because reparations would increase feelings of hostility and discrimination towards African Americans. Then on their third contention about social justice, they're saying that if the federal government passes reparations, then they will have supported reparations and therefore be more likely to support that. That's circular logic. That's just saying that if the government supports something, then it supports something. And that's not a reason to vote, that's not a reason to vote nay. They can't prove that once the federal government makes one decision, it will never change its decision, which is obviously false, and reparations are not in the status quo, and there's still the talk of them having them now. So this is completely logically false. And then second, they claim that the discourse about reparations supports social justice, but turn this against them because their logic implies that once reparations happen, once reparations are paid, this conversation about whether they are needed will end. And this investigation into the historical crime of slavery will end. Look to the historical example about how after the U.S. federal government paid reparations to Japanese Americans who were interned during World War I, we no longer talk about racism towards Japanese Americans. We won't recognize that problem unless we're talking about specifically that context. We still agree that it is a done deal and it's done, and it's not good for us to view racism in that context in America. Therefore, I urge a negative ballot.
Alright, yes.
Would you like to ask the first question?
Sure. So you stated that because police brutality does not affect all African Americans, that not all African Americans deserve reparations. Are you saying that only African Americans who have specifically been harmed by either police brutality or slavery should be paid reparations?
We're saying that only African Americans who have suffered police brutality should have reparations for police brutality. And we're saying that in the status quo this already happens, so reparations to all African Americans, regardless of what has happened to them, is not necessary based on your contention.
What's your evidence that all African Americans who are harmed by police brutality?
Well, I asked you for a number of African Americans who...
reparations?
I asked you for a number that of how many African Americans have been affected by police brutality, and you haven't provided that number. And we also don't know whether the ones that have been affected by police brutality have actually gotten compensation, or their families have gotten compensation.
Okay,
Like, I can just bring up the example, like, I know Eric Garner's family got $6 million after he was wrongfully killed. So I know reparations still happen in that sense in the status quo.
But the problem that we're
Can I
trying
ask
to
a
figure out
question?
is, yeah, sure.
Okay, so when you talk about the social justice issue, that discourse is necessary. If discourse about reparations is the thing that causes social justice to happen, then why doesn't just this debate about talking about reparations solve for that?
Because we don't actually have any power in the government, because we're high school students.
So only
what we're
government
saying is
discourse
that we
counts. Is
should
that what you're saying?
No, what we're saying is that we should extend this discourse to actually change government policies.
Okay, so are you saying that policies matter or government discourse matters?
Okay, we're saying that essentially through government discourse, not only can we implement reparations that will help the economic condition of African Americans, it will also increase discourse and talk about changing government policies.
So, like, let me get this straight. You're saying that when the government passes reparations, people will still, like, outside of the government will still talk about why reparations are necessary?
Yes.
Well, I mean, how can that be true when once reparations are done and once they have happened, what is the incentive to keep talking about why they need to happen? Isn't that issue being settled? Won't this end the conversation?
It definitely won't, because if you look to the example of the civil rights movement, they didn't just stop after the abolishment of slavery. They continued to try to desegregate society and increase African American rights.
Okay, that's a really good point, because they didn't have reparations back then, so doesn't that mean social justice can happen in the absence of reparations?
That's not exactly true, because
But you
what's
just
happening,
said that that's what
what's
happens.
happening in the status quo is that not enough people think that racism is a severe problem. Because
So will racists change their mind based on paying reparations to African Americans? Will racist people suddenly not be racist because they see African Americans are being paid?
what we're trying to do is open up the conversation.
But why isn't the conversation already opened, and why is that necessary for social justice? Since you just told me that social justice in the past has happened without reparations, why are they key?
Because right now, social justice isn't happening without reparations. We need reparations
So are you saying
to
social
start the
justice has never
discussion.
happened?
Are you just gonna say that social justice is just gonna happen without us doing anything to initiate it?
Well, I'm saying why reparations are necessarily specific, because I agree that we should have reforms and we should continue moving towards equality and non-discrimination, but I don't understand why reparations in the form of money and other programs specifically for African Americans are necessary at all.